Hey guys, Scott here. Today I want to talk about the different races in FTL and what they do on your ship, because I feel like the game doesn't really give you as much information as it could about their strengths and weaknesses, and once you know their strengths and weaknesses, you actually can get more out of them. So we're just going to go through all the different races, what they're good at, what they're bad at, and how they fit into a game typically. So we'll start with a human. They're obviously very boring, but the thing about humans is that they're actually pretty good. It turns out not having any kind of weaknesses is a really big deal, and it means their flexibility makes them able to do anything. So they're actually pretty cool. There's not really much to talk about. They can fit into any position on the ship. They can man a system, they can be a repair crew, they can be a anti-boarding crew. They can do quite a lot. So if you get the chance to pick up a human, I definitely recommend it, because they also have the human blue option to get a free Mantis. Next up on the list is NG. NG are definitely what I would call a reactive crew member. So that means that you typically wouldn't want to have an NG manning a system unless you absolutely had to. And this is because as soon as some kind of damage breaks out on your ship, you would much prefer to have your NG go and fix that damage. So if you had the options of having an NG man your weapons and a spare rock manning the doors, I would definitely swap those over so that the rock is manning the weapons straight away. Because there's no point having a crew member manned in any of your systems if they're going to run out of the room as soon as there's a fire somewhere. So NG obviously very good at repair crew members, really not good at much else. I mean, as soon as you get boarded, they're terrible, and they just kind of suck. But when it comes to repairs, I think repairs are actually extremely important to the game, so that's partially why NG are so good. Because just being able to get your systems back online as quickly as possible is a really big strength. So that's why we would pretty much refer to NG as a reactive crew type, because their best use is to be on standby for when something happens. Similarly, we also have Mantis. Mantis are also a reactionary crew member. They just pretty much sit and wait until somebody boards onto your ship, and then for the same reason as the NG, there's no point having your Mantis manning a system when they're just going to run out of the room and go fight people. And this isn't always like the case. I mean, if you only have 3 crew members, yeah, have your Mantis, you know, be a weapons guy or be the engines guy. But as soon as you have a larger roster of crew, that's when you might decide, hey, I'm gonna have my Mantis in a lower priority system, so that if they need to leave, it's not a big deal. You know, if you've got a fully trained engine Mantis supplying you with 10% evasion, having lose that evasion by having him leave the room actually sucks more than if he's in the sensors and he's just supplying you sight onto the enemy ship. I wouldn't recommend having more than 2 Mantis if possible, unless you're playing on a 4-man teleporter ship, because as soon as you go over 2 Mantis, you're suddenly weak to fires and you're weak to having poor repairs. You really just want 2 Mantis to be able to deal with any of those enemy boarders. That's the best use of Mantis. Up next we have Rock. Rock are actually pretty interesting, because Rock are actually really good if they don't have to move. We all know Rock has that really slow 50% less movement speed, and that's actually a pretty big deal. You wouldn't think so, but it actually is. On ships where the layout is quite large, if you are boarded really far away from your rocks, you're probably going to lose 1 or 2 systems by enemy boarders before they can even go up there and start to fight. And that's like pretty annoying. So rocks are really decent manning like the major systems, like piloting, engines, weapons, shields, that kind of thing, just because they don't have to move out of those systems, and when they can sit in there, especially as a pilot, they're going to be really effective at defending those systems, either from enemy boarders, they can sit in the room longer, or by putting out a fire. The ability to put out a fire and not have to leave the room afterwards to go to a med bay to heal, or to leave the room even during a fire, they can just sit there and put it out. It's actually a really big strength. So we would definitely categorize Rock in the like stationary kind of category, you know? We don't want them moving around our ship too much, because it's really inefficient. Next on my list we have Slugs. Slugs are really interesting. I would actually say Slugs are the strongest crew members in the game because they actually don't really have any weakness at all, and they are immune to mind control. And this makes Slugs extremely good in a couple of systems, specifically piloting and weapons. The reason why a Slug pilot is so good is because not only are you immune to that mind control, and when your pilot gets mind controlled, you suddenly don't have a pilot, and if you don't have a pilot, you don't have any evasion. Shit, that's a bad time. So we're immune to that, but also, when enemy ships have mind control and boarding AI, they will actually aim to fight together. So if we can imagine a scenario where the person manning our weapon systems gets mind control, and then boarders are sent over to our ship, the people who boarded us are actually going to make a beeline for that weapon room because they all want to fight as a team. And we don't really want that. We don't want enemies fighting in our piloting, and we don't want enemies fighting in our weapons because they're really frustrating systems to defend, especially piloting, because a 2v1 scenario in piloting is just the worst. So if we can avoid those systems being susceptible to that, it's really, really good. It's really, really good. So Slugs, definitely up there. Really great. To a lesser extent, they can kind of do everything else as well, but if you want to make the most of them and you have the option, definitely recommend having them as your pilot and your weapons guy. Next on my list is Lanius. Lanius, once again, are pretty interesting. They're actually a bit of a weaker crew member, and it's probably more so for me than it is for people who play the game as it should be played. I play on with no pause, so to have to manage Lanius with closing doors so that they don't vent my ship, it's just something I don't really want to have to focus on or think about. So I tend to kind of not have Lanius on my ships if I can help it. But if I do have to have one, I'll typically stick them in a smaller system somewhere, like the sensors or the doors. Because if we take damage to a system like our weapons or our shields, if we had a Lanius manning that system, doing repairs is a real pain in the ass because there's no air in that room. So anyone you send in to go and do repairs, they're just going to have a really, really difficult time. If you have two Lanius, they're actually pretty good at fighting off enemy invaders, but it's also pretty rare to have two Lanius on your ship. You'd have to, like, probably buy one, or start with one and get a free one. So Lanius, not the best, but you can still make use of them. Just put them in a small room and leave them there. Next on our list is probably the most interesting one is Zoltans. We make jokes that Zoltans are basically batteries. We just put them in the room and plug them into the wall, and that's really true. The thing about Zoltans is that they supply power to whatever system they're in, so you definitely want to have them in a system, in a room on your ship that can benefit from an extra reactor power. So you obviously wouldn't want to put them in your piloting, your sensors, or your doors, because those subsystems don't need any reactor power, so it's a waste. But the interesting thing with Zoltans is that because they are supplying power to the system room that they're in, if you suddenly move them out of that room, there is a decent chance that they're going to depower something if you don't have any spare reactor power ready. So for this reason, I don't really like putting my Zoltans into weapons, because they'll always power the weapon in slot 1 to the far left, and if you suddenly have to move your Zoltan out of that room and you haven't got any spare reactor power, that weapon is going to depower, and that is really frustrating, especially if it's a slow charging weapon, or it's a really important weapon. Depowering that because the Zoltan moves out of the room, very, very frustrating. So for me, I would typically enjoy having my Zoltans in the engines or the shields, probably engines unless I have two. The only time you ever really want to move a Zoltan is if you're playing a ship that has like a clone bay and there's some kind of ion threat in some way. Moving a Zoltan into the clone bay to combat the ion threat is really, really good, because Zoltans will always provide power to a system regardless of if it gets ioned or not. Also, Zoltans are pretty weak to fire and boarding, so to put them in a room where they are never really going to move, then that's probably better than having them in a, you know, somewhere where they're going to be running around your ship, depowering and powering all of your stuff. So last on my list, I have Crystal. Crystal are pretty rare, so it's not that big. It's not really. There's not a whole lot to really go into about Crystal. They're pretty decent at just about everything, except fighting fire. Crystal actually have a slower firefighting speed than other races. So for me, as soon as I know there's a fire and I've got a crystal fighting it, I might have to send an extra person or 2 extra people if it's a really drastic fire, because I know that crystal might not actually put it out before it spreads. Other than that, they're pretty decent. They can make decent pilots. The ability to lock down a room is pretty cool, as it'll just keep out borders and stuff like that. But I don't know, they're really not that exciting. I guess the less damage from suffocation is pretty cool as well. So if you need to go and repair a broken oxygen or something and you want to go, you're like, oh crap, who do I send? Crystal would be up there on the list. But they're definitely also a stationary crew member with that slow movement speed. So now that we know what everyone's good at, you might be able to organize your crew as you get them to kind of fit into their endgame roles. So my perfect endgame looking crew might be something like a slug pilot, a Zoltan in the engines, a slug in the weapons, a rock in the shields, 2 NG repair squad, and 2 Mantis defense squad. That's probably my ideal scenario. And if you don't have something, you're not always going to get it. So if you don't have that kind of thing, then you just kind of want to fit people where they're working at their best. So, you know, if we're short on a rock, then we might have a human in the shields, or if we're short on an NG, we might just put a human in that repair squad. Just kind of mixing and matching until you have the best kind of balance. I think that's pretty much it. That's all I can really think of when it comes to the crew. Maybe you could try experimenting with different crew in different positions and see how they go. And yeah, just kind of think, wow, is this good here or is this good there? Have fun on FTL, have fun organizing your crew, and I'll see you later.